All right, so everybody, if you're listening as a first-time listener, please like, subscribe, share. If you're listening to us on the radio, we greatly appreciate this. We have a really, really great guest coming on. He's been on multiple times talking about many different issues. But due to the issues in Israel, I knew that when this started, he was going to be the right man for the job to come on here and speak the truth. We've heard a lot, mainstream media, podcasters mouthing off, saying what they believe, what they think. We're going to go straight down to the nitty gritty and get the truth from Daniel Levin. It's DanielLevinAuthor.com, proof of life. He's got a lot of experience in dealing with hostage situations, originally from Israel, was in the military over there, and obviously he's involved in diplomacy and mediation efforts in war zones all around the world. Daniel, thanks so much for always coming on with us.
Thanks, Rob. It's my pleasure.
So let's talk about this because you have a lot of connections on the ground. Obviously, you were in that area for quite a long time growing up and have been there many times since that time. Can you talk about what's going on for people that don't really know because they're getting all these mixed signals from TV and radio?
Sure. I mean, if you just look at this week on Saturday morning at around 6:30 local time in Israel, the rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip into southern Israel. It turned out to be a diversion tactic. This is nothing new. People go into shelters. But what then happened is that thousands of militant fighters from Hamas breached the border wall and moved into southern Israel. First of all, the communities around the Gaza Strip, the Jewish kibbutzim, meaning several kibbutz communities and other smaller communities, a southern city called Sderot, and even farther north, and just started to indiscriminately execute people, children, old people, young people, without any kind of distinction between civilians and military. There was very little military in the area, which we can get to later on why that was the case, but killed tremendous amount of people. There was also a music festival in that region, and clearly the attack had been planned also to trap many people. Hundreds of concert goers in that music festival were killed too. Clearly the shooting started from one side, intended to drive the mostly young visitors of that festival to the exits, and then killers were waiting for them at the exit too. So killed hundreds of people, and then scores of people, probably more than 150, possibly more than 200 people were taken hostage. Some gravely wounded were taken hostage into the Gaza Strip. So that's where we find ourselves now, 6 days after this attack. In the meantime, there's been retaliation of Israel and bombing of the Gaza Strip. So we're heading towards a full-scale war. That's the status on the ground right now before we even get into context and history and outside powers and so on.
We might go a little bit all over the place, but people listening to this, be patient with us because I do want to get to some of these questions. I've been listening to left media and right media. I do hear this about what's going on. I want you to clear the ear for this because obviously you've had a lot of dealings in the area in general. Obviously, Netanyahu's back in power. There's a lot of people in Israel that don't appreciate that due to the issues with the Supreme Court. His approval ratings are very far down. And it's, from what I know about Israel is they have the best spies in the world. I think they're better than America's spies. There's no even contest in my mind. We could disagree with other people on that, but that's personally what I believe. Obviously, a great defense as far as the Iron Dome, as far as the military goes. Do you feel like that the government, and I hate to say it like this because I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I did have people wanting to ask this question, so I'm going to ask this gently. Do you feel like the government could have known something about this and kind of just let this happen due to Netanyahu's issues with the Israeli people, due to his issues also with a lot of people not wanting him in power in general?
So please be patient with me with my answer. I'm going to try not to be political or polemic here. I don't think the left-right thing, let's just throw that out the window for purpose of this conversation. And who's trying to position even statements from American politicians this week on that, just shameful statements. I don't want to even get into that. Here's just some context. Benjamin Netanyahu has been leader of the Likud party for decades. He has been prime minister of Israel for 12 of the last 14 years. He is from a storied, let's call it right wing, meaning a very right of center political family. His father was a political head of that movement. His brother, Yonatan Netanyahu, was the commando leader of the Israeli unit that managed to rescue the hostages in Entebbe when in the 70s a plane was hijacked. He was the one who was killed, the one Israeli casualty. So it's a storied family. Netanyahu himself served in the most elite of Israeli army units called Seyeret Matkal. He actually was a junior officer when, at the time, the head of Seyeret Matkal, chief of staff, later was Ehud Barak, later Prime Minister. Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of the Labour Party, who tried in Camp David to reach an agreement with Yasser Arafat under Bill Clinton's administration. So here's a little bit of context. Netanyahu came to power in the 90s after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. He was accused of having incited against that. There were demonstrations of Rabin in a Nazi uniform or dressed like Arafat because of his willingness to return territories for peace. So there's a little bit of context here. Netanyahu's whole point was that only he is the one who can deliver security to Israel. So the fact that this now happened under his watch is, of course, particularly shameful. Now, a little bit of context here too. The Israeli, and not just Netanyahu, but again, since he's been in power for 12 of the last 14 years, a lot of this is on him. His view was always that the Israeli governments have been very right-wing, meaning they're natural allies within the Israeli coalition. And this was very clear in this year since the last election, where the national religious settlers who occupy the West Bank and the ultra-religious parties, who as a bloc now almost exclusively vote for right-wing governments, which, by the way, in the United States, ultra-religious Jewish groups vote almost exclusively for Donald Trump and the Republican Party too. Now, the deal that was reached essentially, and the thinking that in those circles was they can manage Hamas, which rules over the Gaza Strip, and Hamas came to power following the ill-fated 2006 elections in the Gaza Strip, which were probably a mistake. We can get to that too. The U.S. George W. Bush administration had a lot to do with that. But they have been ruling there, and the Israeli government under Netanyahu has always thought they can reach an agreement. Every once in a while, there'll be rocket attacks, might be a terrorist attack here or there, but something they can manage. And whenever they need to react more forcefully, they can clip the wings of Hamas periodically. What in Israel is called, translated, mowing the grass. Every once in a while, they can mow the grass in Hamas. But by doing that, they also undermined the Palestinian Authority under Abu Mazen in the West Bank. Why did they do that? Because they don't want to reach an agreement with the Palestinians in the West Bank, because that would mean territorial concessions and dismantling some settlements, which is something that not only is completely unacceptable to members of his coalition, but actually also doesn't really have a Jewish Israeli majority supporting it in today's demographics in Israel. Don't forget that religious parts of the population that tend to vote more right-wing are growing at a much faster pace than secular, more progressive left-wing parts of the population. So Israel is changing before our eyes, but the thinking always was that Netanyahu's government, through this sort of brawny, muscular approach, can always manage to keep the peace. Every once in a while, there's a flare-up in the north with Hezbollah, in the south with Hamas, but they can keep the country safe. And now these attacks 6 days ago obviously blew all that illusion out of the water. There have been serious and senior military and intelligence commanders who have warned the political leadership, not just that they're under illusion, but also that the very provocative steps that the Netanyahu government has taken, you alluded to it, weakening the Supreme Court in order to give it absolute majority to limit any restrictions on Netanyahu's government's power. All those things would ultimately create a weakening of the Israeli leadership and intelligence community, many of whom distrust Netanyahu and his government. And just for reference, one of the ministers in Netanyahu's government, his name is Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was a member of a right-wing fraction that used to follow a New York-born Rabbi Meir Kahane, who was outlawed in the 80s and 90s in Israel, his party at the time, because they were considered fascist. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is now Minister for Public Security, was considered too radical for the Israelis to serve in the army. He was himself disqualified from serving the Israeli army. He's now Minister of Public Security. So listeners to your show need to understand when I'm speaking, and I'm not speaking with any partisan left or right. I'm just giving you facts so that they put into context the nature of this government. The idea always was, well, we might be right wing, but we can keep the country safe because we understand that we can manage and suppress. And they completely misread the situation on the ground with Hamas. By the way, when you come to intelligence breakdown, because you alluded to the quality of Israeli intelligence,
Yeah.
not only were they misinformed, but in fact, even not only Iranians and Hezbollah leaders didn't know about this attack. In fact, even Hamas leaders who are currently in Gaza and even Hamas leaders who are currently in Qatar, in Doha, because they spread their leaders all over, many of them were not informed of the details of this attack and the timing of this attack. So the people, the hardliners in Gaza of Hamas that executed this, did this with tremendous discipline, also when it comes to communications discipline. So it's a complete underestimation of a deadly enemy where people did not understand. They thought they can manage Hamas and come to terms with them with hostage exchanges here or there, and didn't understand the vicious, deadly terrorist resolve that Hamas has, similar to ISIS.
Obviously, this is two different situations, but I kind of compare this, and you can agree or disagree with me, Daniel, with what happened at not with 9/11 in this country. There was a lot of aspects that I believe are similar. When 9/11 in this country, a lot of the intelligence weren't working together. They were working and they were misinformed by other intelligence agencies. There was information that went up to Condoleezza Rice, that went to the vice president, Dick Cheney at the time, even went to President Bush, worrying about Al Qaeda. They're going to strike August 2001, excuse me. And no one kind of did anything. They just kind of let it under the rug. Obviously, we know what happened in September of 2001. Does some of those aspects, obviously, different regions of the world, different attacks, do they kind of make this kind of similar, or do you disagree with that?
I think they're similar in terms of a breakdown of intelligence and intelligence gathering. I think
Sure.
Israel got very used, a little bit like the United States, to playing high-tech wars, meaning Israel's been leading in cybersecurity. They have a very famous military unit called 8200, which is a cyber military intelligence unit that develops incredible cyber tools. Some of them then get weaponized later by people who leave that unit and do this for commerce. The killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi dissident, his phones and phones of his friends were penetrated by Pegasus software done by a company of NSO, which was founded by graduates of that unit. So Israel got very comfortable with its cyber capability and may have underestimated the continued need for human intelligence, meaning people on the ground. It's very hard to penetrate in the Gaza Strip. And I think in the US, something similar happened, not only in the misreading of information, but in the flawed gathering of information. But there are some significant differences. First of all, just in proportion, the amount of casualties here, the number unfortunately tragically keeps rising, but the number of casualties in proportion would have meant around 50,000 casualties in 9/11. So just to give you a sense of proportion. And the other issue that we do have to keep in mind, 9/11 was really traumatic for the US, watching the Twin Towers collapse, the attack on the Pentagon and so on. But at no moment was it an existential threat to the United States. The
Sure.
United States has not fought a war other than an internal war, meaning the civil war with slavery. It hasn't fought a war since its existence where its own survival would be threatened. It hasn't been threatened by Canada or Mexico or any other party on its shores. Even Pearl Harbor wasn't an existential threat to the United States. Israel has lived since its existence in 1948 under the constant situation that the first war that it loses is going to be its last war. And what Hamas now laid bare is just this deep, deep vulnerability, because we do have to keep something in mind. It fired thousands of rockets, probably north of 2,000 rockets on the first day. The rockets coming from the Gaza Strip and Hamas are child play compared to the rockets that Hezbollah has to the north, anywhere between 150 and 250,000 missiles, all of which are significantly more sophisticated than the ones that Hamas has, some of which also have the ability to carry non-conventional warheads. I don't mean nuclear, but I mean biological or chemical ones. And
Right.
that's before we even get into Iranian involvement into the whole thing. So I think that Israel is now confronted with the reality that it's politics. Again, it's not a political statement. I'm just stating a fact, which is the politics of continued occupation. I'm not saying also, by the way, for those who are going to jump on this, that had Israel evacuated the West Bank, none of this would have happened. Again, for context, Israel had occupied the Gaza Strip since 1967, taking it over from Egypt until 2005. And it evacuated the Gaza Strip under Ariel Sharon when he was prime minister at the time in 2005, and 8,500 Jewish settlers were forced to leave their homes in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip has no biblical importance, but of course there was huge resistance to that among settler and right-wing groups in Israel. It has since focused on creating irreversible facts in the West Bank, meaning the area between the Green Line of 1967, Israel and East Jerusalem, and the Jordanian border, the Jordan River. So that's what's called the East Bank, the West Bank of the Jordan River, sorry. And so this continued occupation has weakened Israel in many different respects, not only in creating disunity among the population, but also the fact that if you take just a simple logistical question, why were those communities around the Gaza Strip left so vulnerable? Well, that's because all the military units that should be guarding that are currently in the West Bank guarding the settlements there, right? And it took hours, sometimes 10 hours, shamefully, to move crack military units to the areas. It took over 3 days just to clear out the towns around the Gaza Strip of Hamas terrorists. And in fact, there still are scores of Hamas terrorists in Israel itself hiding out. So that's not over yet, 6 days after this attack. So this tremendous vulnerability and the dilution of military power because of the occupation is laid bare. Anyone who wants to come after me for that statement should feel free to do that, but let's do it on facts and not ideology again.
What's going to happen with the peace talks that were going on with Saudi Arabia?
They're dead.
Yeah.
The Saudis cannot afford, there's going to be obviously huge amounts of Palestinian civilians that are going to die in the Gaza Strip. They already have died already. Israel is going to the incursion in the Gaza Strip is probably going to be a bifurcation of the Gaza Strip. They've already given residents of North Gaza 24 hours to clear and go to the south or to cross into Egypt in the Rafah crossing on the border with Egypt. And so what this means in all likelihood is some form of incursion and temporary occupation of northern Gaza. It's something Israel's done before, but it's going to come with thousands and thousands of Palestinian casualties and hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians. So the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman simply cannot afford in the current climate to reach some kind of a peace agreement. I, in fact, think that the agreements with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco might be vulnerable as a result of that, because the street in those countries, the Arab street in those countries, is far more friendly towards the Palestinian cause than the leaders in those countries actually are. In part, it's no doubt that the part of the reason for this attack from Hamas's side, and again, before we get even into Iran and whether they were part of this, not part of it, what they stand to benefit, part of the reason for this attack was that the Palestinians felt that they were being left out of this new love affair between Israel and the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. And they wanted also to remind everyone that there's not going to be any peaceful coexistence until the Palestinian issue is not going to be solved with some kind of a two-state solution. So this was a really, again, I'm not saying that meaningful negotiations would have prevented this kind of a slaughter. Hamas is a murderous, terrorist organization, and nothing, no ideology, no history, no context justifies the slaughter of innocent people the way this has happened. And I don't want anyone to put words in my mouth. I have no patience for that. I served in the Israeli army. I've lost friends in these attacks. I've lost family members. I'm not in a good mood to hear any troll come at me for my political views here, but there still is historical context, and the Palestinians sent a very, very painful reminder to the Israelis and to the world that this place will not live in peace until the Israeli-Palestinian issue is going to be resolved.
But let me ask you this, because where is Hezbollah getting all these rockets, and Hamas too? Is this coming from Iran? And then also, if you could just bring Iran into that situation, because they were chanting death to America on their parliament floor while this was going on, death to Israel. I mean, it could be them just taking responsibility because they want to pump this up and use this to their advantage. You know, obviously more about this than I do.
So Hamas and Hezbollah are not the same when it comes to Iran, and we shouldn't forget that. First of all, just for your viewers who are not aware of it, 99.9% of the Muslim population in the Gaza Strip is Sunni Islam, right? whereas the Iranians are Shia Islam. There's a big split within Islam. For those of you who know that, I apologize for telling you things you know, but for those of your listeners and subscribers who don't, I think some context is necessary. The Iranian strategy, which was carried out with great efficiency and effect under the leader of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guard, who was assassinated 2.5 years ago in January 2001 in Baghdad. His name is Qasem Soleimani. Their strategy was essentially to create 4 external satellite militias and threats, both threats to Israel and also threats to the Sunni monarchies that whom they despise, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others, okay, the Jordanians. And those 4 satellites were not Hamas. Again, the satellites were the Iraqi governments, Shia-dominated Iraqi government in Baghdad, number one. Number two, the Assad regime in Damascus, which is an Alawi subsect of Shia Islam in Damascus in Syria, which has obviously been propped up first only by Iran and then by Iran and Russia. Third, the Houthi militias in Yemen that have with great success taken over Yemen and also repelled the Saudi and Emirati forces. And fourth, the Hezbollah militia, the most dangerous and best organized of all those militias, which is de facto controlling Lebanon. Now, Hamas is a whole different story. We can get to that in a moment. The Hezbollah militia under Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of that, is the military arm of the Shia leaders. They really control Lebanon. They're in southern Lebanon and South Beirut. They've suffered significant losses in the Syrian war when they had to bail out Bashar al-Assad because of ineptitude of his own forces. And they lost a lot of forces and a lot of ammunition. Hezbollah is still in the phase of restocking its forces. Some of the best missiles that Hezbollah has comes via Iran. It had been transported through southern Syria, but Israel was able to stop a lot of those transports. So that became much more cumbersome. This attack by Hamas on Israel is not good timing for Hezbollah. They're not at a place where they really want to have a full-fledged engagement with Israel. The rockets that they've been launching at the Saba farms in the north, at Israel right now, are not attacks that are intended to start a war. They're attacks intended to signal to their own people that they also can do something. They just don't want to skip this whole party. Hamas is a different story. Hamas has not coordinated this. Now, there's been very intense training of the elite brigade of Hezbollah in cooperation with them, with Hamas, just based on the common enemy of Israel, not on any religious affiliation, again, because the Shia and Sunni Muslims do tend to hate each other. So there's no love lost ideologically there, okay? And by far, most of the Palestinians and Muslim Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are Sunni Muslims. But there has been some coordination. I can tell you for a fact, I interact with players in the region on all sides of the conflict, including on the Iranian side, that while they were, of course, were aware that Hamas has been training for attacks in Israel, they have been aware of that. They had meetings in Beirut and Damascus. They were unaware of this particular attack, of its specifics, of its timing, any of that. They certainly didn't give the order for that. This is not a good time. And in fact, Hamas has been sending very gentle signals towards the US and the West, as also evidenced with the prisoner swap with the US and the $6 billion of South Korean funds that were transferred to the Qatari central bank that had been frozen, Iranian funds that were done for oil deliveries had been frozen, that as part of this prisoner swap, now those funds were refrozen. So this attack, as much as they may celebrate the loss of Israeli or Jewish life, this attack was not something that was particularly well suited for Hezbollah and for Tehran also. But that doesn't mean that Israel isn't hugely vulnerable. If Hezbollah got involved in this war now, it would be a huge vulnerability because of a two-front war.
DanielLevineAuthor.com. Again, Proof of Life is the book. Definitely check it out. So obviously, again, you know a lot about this subject. Daniel, what do you think is the timetable? Is this going to be something that's a long, drawn-out war, or is this something that could end within the next month?
No, this is going to be a long drawn out. And first of all, there's no most heartbreaking because just the loss of life is so devastating. The shattered families are never going to recover on all sides of this conflict. It just has to be said. The Palestinians who are paying a price are not the ones who went around Israel and started shooting up innocent children. The Palestinians who are paying the lives are victims of the Hamas the same way others are trapped in what we call the largest outdoor prison in the world. 140 square miles. That's the 2.5 million people living like slums. I've spent time in the Gaza Strip, both as a civilian and in Israeli army uniform in 1990. I can tell you it's unlike a place you've ever seen. It is really the biggest outdoor place of misery that you can possibly imagine. So those people are victims of this, and it has to be said too. Now, there's no military solution to this problem. You're not going to eradicate Gaza. You're not going to just kill 2.5 million people, obviously. Hamas is not just a political movement and it's not just a terrorist militia. Hamas is also an ideology. And again, for context of your listeners, there is a cascade here of radicalization that we just cannot forget. Israel started to negotiate in the 70s with Palestinian movements, but they never reached an agreement. And at every round, the Palestinians became more radical. You went from the Fatah movement with Yasser Arafat to the Abu Nidal terrorist movements to the Liberation Front for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine with Josh Chabash that was backed by the Syrians, and so on and so on and so on until you got Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and they completely crushed the Palestinian Authority in the elections 2005 2006. And because of the political realities on the ground and the way their parliament works, they have a disproportionate majority, and Hamas completely took control over the Gaza Strip. Now, just like ISIS is a result of tremendous strategic and tactical mistakes, ISIS, again, didn't start as a religious movement. ISIS was started by Saddam Hussein's military officers who had nowhere to go and no money to make anywhere when Saddam's army was crushed. Rather than integrate them properly into a new Iraqi army, they started to basically go rogue and founded ISIS. It wasn't about a religious ideology. Hamas started as a subpart of the Muslim Brotherhood that is organized by Egypt. They have since cut themselves loose from that. The reason they did that is because the Muslim Brotherhood is thought of as a threat in the Gulf monarchies. And because of that, Hamas wanted to continue to receive funds primarily from Qatar. They disavowed their connection to the Muslim Brotherhood. They're very, very shrewd, but more than just being a movement and a militia, they're also an ideology, and you do not end an ideology with this kind of a ground war now. So there's no plan for the day after the day after. Right now, Israel is in mourning. It's completely traumatized, and it is extremely angry. Even the most progressive Israeli is saying right now that you need to destroy Hamas. I understand this anger, but there's no plan for the day after. And we mustn't forget one thing. For the hostages who are being held right now, this kind of a ground war with the casualties on the Palestinian side is going to mean near certain death. So if there's going to be, I know that there are efforts, Israel appointed a very controversial general called Gal Hirsch to lead the coordination efforts for the hostages, but the longer this war goes on, and Israel is in no mood to give any concessions, meaning anything Hamas would want in return for the hostages, is not going to happen. So I fear this can last a long, long time. And my biggest fear, not my biggest fear, I shouldn't say that, but one of the byproducts is when all the dust settles and all the dead are buried, all these societies on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side are going to emerge even more radicalized, meaning we're going to be even farther away from any form of two-state solutions where these nations can live side by side. It's going to take decades for the hatred and the distrust and the pain to at some point go away, where people are going to be willing to rebuild something rather than just continue to just kill each other.
I want to ask you this, Daniel, to go and talk about today. Today's called the Day of Rage. There's protests all around the world, Europe, United States. We're seeing at many universities around the country where there's people, white, black, they're running around, Hispanic with Palestinian flags, protesting. There's even been hate crimes against people of Jewish descent as far as that goes. Are you worried about something happening in this country? We do have an open border. There's many people coming in. There's supposedly they've caught, depending on what news site you watch or listen to, it says about 90-ish so-called terrorists coming in from the border. Do you think that something could happen here, or if not here, maybe even in Europe?
No, I don't want to dignify this kind of stuff. This is right-wing garbage
Okay.
trolling. This is like Tom Cotton used to, ran his Senate campaign thinking they're going to be ISIS fighters entering the border. The biggest vulnerability of Biden, everyone knows that, is immigration, border control. It's nothing new. There hasn't been an American administration that has dealt with the border intelligently. It's a very complicated idea. It's not like there are truckloads or plane loads of ISIS or Hamas fighters flying to Mexico and entering the border. This is just a non-issue. I'm getting so sick and tired of this tragedy being used for political purposes.
Yeah,
The biggest atrocities against Jewish institutions and synagogues that have happened, like in Pittsburgh, have happened by
right.
right-wing white shooters. Let's not forget that. So please, everyone, could we just stop using these awful tragedies for political purposes like that? They have rage. I mean, I don't have any understanding for anybody who, after the slaughter of innocent children, feels
Yeah,
the need to go out and demonstrate against Israel and say this is all Israel's fault. I have in huge issues with the occupation. I have been
yeah,
outspoken on that. I have
right.
Palestinian friends. I teach in Palestinian universities. I'm comfortable there. I work for all sides in this and trying to find understandings. But at the end of the day, it's very, very easy and cheap to don on a Palestinian flag or an Israeli flag, go and demonstrate and shout death to the other side. When at some point you have to find some solutions, and the solutions are not going to come from additional hate. So all this
Yeah,
trolling about, Islamic-based attacks, the countries that do have radical Islamist threats are the ones in Europe. There was an
yeah,
attack in France, in northern France, near the Belgian border, where a teacher, a non-Jewish teacher, a teacher of a public school, was stabbed to death by an Islamist terrorist. Those are communities that are also dealing with a colonial heritage, meaning North African, Moroccan, Algerian, Tunisian radicalized youth who live impoverished in the suburbs of their large cities, whether that's in Brussels or in Paris, and are radicalized. That's a completely different issue. A lot of them were ISIS recruits in Syria. A lot of the most gruesome events in Syria, including the executions of Americans like James Foley and Stephen Sotloff in 2014, were carried out by radicalized European recruited ISIS members. But this is a completely different United States. So the thought, whether it's Fox News or One America, whatever network,
yeah,
Breitbart, the idea that we're going to exploit these kinds of tragedies for that kind of garbage. Can you even imagine President Biden or any Democratic congressman had said the kind of stuff that Trump said recently about going after Netanyahu, calling the Israeli
yeah,
Minister of Defense a jerk, saying Hezbollah is smart? Even
yeah.
imagine President Biden had said anything like that, the kind of outcry that would have happened on the Republican side. So I'm getting so sick and tired of this stuff. If Americans want to keep trolling that, they'll troll it for their own purposes. But
Yeah.
in the meantime, in America, in Israel, in the Middle East, on all sides of these conflicts, parents are just burying their children. So we don't have the luxury of this kind of garbage trolling. And I'm just no interest in even talking about that anymore.
Well, I mean, just going back to your point as far as Europe with the terror cells there, a lot of that is because of the United States and Europe going into Afghanistan, Iraq, being involved in all these conflicts all around the Middle East, tearing up these people's homelands, and then they become refugees. They come over to Europe, obviously settle in. And as you just stated very clearly about the poverty there and the hate because they were basically refugees obviously and had to move to a totally different culture, totally different country, and they're trying to live the best they can and they can't because it's
Yeah, I mean,
very hard.
every immigration problem, just like every drug
Right.
problem, you can't solve with a wall. You just can't. There's
Right.
always a way around a
I agree
wall.
with you.
Drug problems, you have to deal with the demand, and then you deal with the supply, right? If you stop the addictions, you stop the supply. Same thing with immigration. If you're going to have completely broken, corrupt, and broken countries in South America where masses of the population are seeking a better future to the north, then the immigration just won't stop. There's no border wall solution to the immigration problem. There are different policies, and I don't think American policy is particularly effective. I think there's a lot that parties should find a way to work together to come up with solutions that actually work rather than just trolling for an election. But no party has really solved it, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans. But the idea that we're going to use
Yeah.
these tragedies to discuss, just for the sake of exploiting it, and then talk about immigration, the idea that terror cells are coming across the border, it's just that it's a kind of
Yeah.
conspiracy theory that weakens a country, that just makes us hate each other. And
Yeah.
whether that's on vaccine skepticism or whether it's on this stuff, I just don't. I don't want to give that even airtime and any more oxygen because it's so deadly.
I think there's a lot of politicians on both sides that want people to hate each other so they can keep their agendas moving forward. Just last point on that, because I do want to move on to the last two questions. You know, we do have people like AOC and that group there who I used to personally support are pushing the BDS thing. They've been doing that for years. And also, obviously, pushing the Palestinian rights. I agree with you. I think there's problems on both sides of this issue, and it's been going on for years upon years on end. But as Trump is a clown and says all kinds of these freaking stupid things, we do have people on the left that are out of their minds also, to be fair on both sides to people listening too. But we can move forward on that. I do want to ask you about the Biden administration. Obviously, Tony Blinken's been over there. They've been working to release some of the hostages that are Americans. They've got to some have, perished and passed on. What should the Biden administration be doing? Because they do have a lot of hands right now in Ukraine and NATO and pushing a lot of money into there. And now with this issue in the Middle East, which I personally believe, and people may not agree with this that are watching, is way more scarier than what's going on in Ukraine. I think we need to be more worried about Israel and Palestine and that issue more so than Ukraine now. But what is the move for the Biden administration right now?
Oh, there's a lot packed in here. I do want to say one thing quickly, because just to answer what you first said, I think you can disagree with AOC. I think there's also a difference between AOC and some of the others. I actually think she's been quite thoughtful on her comments. And I'm not going to get into BDS. I've spoken to you about that before. I
Right.
think
Yes.
BDS is flawed. I also don't think it contributes anything to solution. I just think it's a form of virtue signaling and trolling, and it actually
Right.
hurts people from the Palestinian side. But I also think it's a false equivalence to talk about something AOC or Rashida Tlaib or Ilan Omar, any of those, what we call the quads, the stuff that they say, and compare that with the incitement that's coming from the radical right. I just think that's a false equivalent, and it's not right. And that's not because I'm left or I'm right. I just think it has
No.
to be said. There's not always a two-side thing. That's what Trump did after Charlottesville, and that was a mistake then too. So I think that needs to be said. There's not everything is the same just because you have a right and a left. So once we leave the AOC and all that, you talk about Ukraine and Israel, and I think we have to be really careful here. There is Israel is obviously of very big strategic importance to the United States, and it is a
Right.
major ally of the United States, and we don't even have to start discussing that. Hasn't always been the case. It wasn't the case in the early years of Israel. It wasn't the case in the Suez Crisis in the 50s
Mhm.
when Israel aligned itself with the UK and France against the US side, kept them in the dark on their plans to attack Nasser. And so it wasn't always the case, and the Israelis would be smart not to take the support for granted forever, despite Biden's really heartfelt and powerful words this week. But uh, there is a big difference between, you can talk about values, shared values, and real allies, and that's an important part of US foreign policy. And then there's a whole other aspect which talks about US strategic interests. And when you talk about military policy, it has to follow also US strategic interest. And if you look at primary conflict zones in the world today, you got sort of Middle East, let's say from Iran to Israel and the Gulf states, right, as a zone.
Right.
You have Ukraine right now, and then you have China and the South China Sea, the confrontation there. And by far the most consequential long-term strategic conflict zone for the US is going to be with China, meaning the two remaining superpowers in the world right now are China and the US. Russia's a nuclear superpower. It's an enormous country landmass-wise, but it's not otherwise a real superpower anymore. Russia can only hold its weight through destructive power. China, on the other hand, China and the US are completely intertwined. We don't have to get into China and US right now. You and I have spoken about it in the past, but it is a major focus, and the possibility of a military escalation in the South China Sea or over Taiwan is something that the US is preoccupied by, and is something it should take extremely seriously. And when you spend time with US military officers and think tanks within the Pentagon, that's really one of the major focus areas. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, it's really hard to put it in the context of Israel, because the issue with Ukraine is not so much whether Ukraine matters to the US per se or not. You could argue that the Ukraine should matter to the Europeans a lot more than it matters to the US. Why should US care more about Ukraine than Poland or Germany or France? Why? That's in their backyard. Let them take the lead on that. The issue with Ukraine is U.S. has demonstrated weakness in the past and lack of resolve when it came to certain conflicts. And by the way, this is bipartisan. So you can criticize Obama in 2013 for his famous red line in Syria, which he didn't carry through. And I know it's been discussed a lot, but it was a huge blunder of the Obama administration. And as McCain at the time said, that red line must have been written with invisible ink. And at the same time, you had other administrations, including again Republican and Democrats, who never confronted Putin. When Putin threatened Georgia, the Bush and Cheney administration told Georgian President Saakashvili at the time that, hey, we'd stand with you. And then when Putin went in and Saakashvili was provoking Putin, called him Lili Putin and all that, at the end, when Russia did invade, the U.S. did nothing and NATO did nothing, right? Was totally abandoned there. So same thing happened first time in the Ukraine. First time that Russia went into the Ukraine and took a chunk out of it and occupied Crimea, the West and the U.S. didn't really react. And so when Putin did now, a year and a half ago, this invasion, he was convinced that the U.S. didn't have the stomach and NATO didn't have the stomach for a military confrontation. And as terrible as his strategic and tactical blunders have been, and he's mishandled this war terribly, it's understandable why he thought that, because we have shown weakness in that respect. So for me, the Ukraine, and this is not about my solidarity with the Ukrainian people. I'm not a politician here. I'm just giving you the analysis. The issue is, it is essential to show resolve with the Ukraine, because if we don't do that, Russia is going to feel completely empowered to bully its way into any area that it wants. And the spread of autocracies right now is something that's so seductive and so appealing to democracies all over the world. Democracy really is under siege. We're taking it for granted. We didn't do that in the last century. I was born in 1963, so I'm 60 years old. I was born only 18 years after the end of the Second World War. And what I'm saying that, other than to say how old I am, is that we really understood the price and the sacrifice that generations made to protect liberty, right, against that kind of fascism and autocracy. And I think that's ancient history. My kids, even though they're of course aware of that history, think of it basically as 20th century history. Whereas, and so this type of freedom and liberty that democracies have brought since the end of the Second World War, I think people are taking for granted in the Western Hemisphere, in Western Europe, and in the United States. And so the Ukraine issue for me is about that, of reminding people that these freedoms are not for free. And that's why, to me, the confrontation with Putin needs to happen there. It's a completely different issue from Israel and the Middle East and showing solidarity and containing Iran. That's an important issue in its own, but it's very hard to compare the two because they're completely different values and strategic objectives.
Right. So we'll end, excuse me, we'll end there. Again, it's DanielLevineAuthor.com. Anywhere else people can follow or find your work?
No, I mean, I speak frequently. Obviously, most of the work that we do, the foundation that I run in Europe, works behind the scenes, so we don't really advertise it that much. Those who want to understand a little bit more about hostage negotiations, including what to expect in this current one, I wrote about it in my book, Proof of Life. I wrote in a prior book, Nothing But a Circus, about the geopolitics of these things. So there's plenty of resources. There are plenty of other competent people who speak on these issues too.
Okay. All right. DanielLevineAuthor.com. Again, Proof of Life. Definitely get the book. You can also look at his other books there too. And he's like the professor, I say. I always learn a little bit more about history when you come on and when we speak in general. But I'm always grateful to speak with you, and keep up the great work. And hopefully you'll get some good things accomplished in your works in general.
Thanks, Robs. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.